Getting a new camera could be a mix of excitement and frustration. Excitement, of course, for all the new features, capabilities, and so forth that you're getting, but obviously frustration in trying to figure out how to get the most out of it, and more importantly, how to set it up and what it should be doing or how it's going to perform. Now, additionally, if you're a RAW shooter like I am and you use Adobe's Lightroom to process your images, part of that process is also going to be figuring out the best sharpening and noise reduction settings for your images. And that's what I want to talk about today. This is an exercise I walk through every time I get a new camera. It usually takes maybe 10 minutes, probably less time than it will take to do this video. And it's something I do within the first few days or often hours of getting a camera before I even start trying to take pictures of stuff with it. Is function check it, make sure it works, start playing with settings. But before I go out and start trying to get serious about photography with it, I'm going to do this process. Now, before I get started here, I want to make a note. There is at least one photographer out there that I've seen who is selling Lightroom presets for what I'm going to show you how to do. Now, if you want to buy something like that, by all means, it's your money. It's your right to do so. Don't let me try to stop you. That said, if I could make a plea in the process of actually not buying stuff like that, the process of setting up Lightroom presets for a camera like this takes maybe 10 minutes. It produces presets that are tailored to your preferences, not what somebody else thinks you should like. And more importantly, it gets you familiar with how your camera performs, what kind of images and stuff that you're going to get out of it across the board at all of the ISO settings. So you have a better idea of what you're going to be using it or what it's going to do when you're out using it. Now, for this process, we do need a couple of things. Obviously, we need a camera and our lens. Now, in this case, I am using my brand new R5 Mark II, and I'm using it with a Canon 28-70 f2L USM lens. Now, of course, whatever camera you're using is going to be the camera that you just got. Hopefully, just got an R5 Mark II, but, maybe whatever. It doesn't matter because this process isn't camera specific. Now, as for the lens, I used to always use my EF 70-200 f4L. My thought process behind doing that was that I could then compare cameras over time and see how images are changing and how image quality changes and stuff like that. In practice, I never did that. And the other part of the thing is that I never really bothered to set up the test charts accurately enough to be able to measure resolution or anything like that. Lighting would change, all of that kind of thing. None of which is really important for this type of application, but would be important if I was trying to compare cameras. So with that said, what lens should you use for these tests? Well, I recommend using the best lens you own. If possible, try not to use an ultra-wide or wide-angle lens. Those tend to not be as good optically as something in the, say, 50 to 200 millimeter range. If you're a crop user, still that range is pretty good, although you can go a little bit wider if you're maybe in micro four thirds or something like that. The reality is lenses in this optical or this range typically have really good optical designs. They tend to be pretty high resolution and they tend to have good corrections built in them optically for your chromatic aberration, distortion, etc. Something that lenses at the very wide end of things are increasingly more reliant on software to fix. Now, at the same time, these aren't super telephotos, which would be optically the best place you could potentially be at, but they'd also require you to have like dozens of yards of space to be able to set up the targets, so that's a little impractical too. Now, of course, for your camera and lens, you're going to also need a tripod. And really, anything that'll hold your camera up and stable is good enough to work for that function here. Beefier is obviously better, but reality is it's not really required. Use the tripod you have. Now, if you're going for the maximum quality route, you want to make sure that there's no camera shake or anything like that in your images. You're going to want to use either a remote release or the camera's self-timer function, but again, it's not strictly necessary. In fact, you can see as I'm shooting these things, that's not what I'm doing at all. I am just mashing the shutter button and moving on to the next image. Now, finally, you need a test target. The one you see here, I made specifically for this purpose, and I will put a link in the description to where you can download it and print yourself a copy and use it till your heart's content. I recommend using a test target though. Mine, someone else's, or one of your own making, just a designed test target, not just shooting stuff you find at random. The idea here is that we want a reasonably controlled baseline, and it also helps to have sort of a color check pattern with black air outlines, as well as resolution wedges for part of the sharpening, which we'll talk about in a bit. Now, keep in mind, we are not trying to measure camera or lens resolution here. We are making a reasonable set of evaluation images to see how our camera performs and get Lightroom defaults set up for it. So, as you can see here, I am not using an optical bench. I am not taking any time to make sure that the test target and everything are perfectly aligned and square and parallel and all of that kind of stuff. It really doesn't matter that much for this process, but get it close enough and you're good. Now, that brings me to the process of shooting these test images. We want to take a frame at every ISO setting on the camera in the whole range, ideally, but at least in the ISO range that we use from the maximum or to the minimum. Now, the R5 Mark II, like most Canon cameras, can be set up to use either full or 1/3 stop increments. I recommend using 1/3 stop increments for this. And the reason for that is that some things can happen at ISOs that have implications at plus or minus 1/3. We'll talk about that when we get to the Lightroom part of this process. That said, since Lightroom interpolates between the ISOs when you set up your preset or default, full stops will absolutely work just fine, even if you use 1/3 stop increments. And in fact, when we get to actually doing this, I think I only use 6 images out of the whole set that I shoot. Now, one other camera setting you might want to change, at least temporarily, just to make this a little bit easier on yourself, is to turn off the image review process. You'll find this on the R5 Mark II on the Assist Shooting menu, page 8 or 9. It's the red menu section at the top. The setting will be the topmost one. It'll say image review. Now, I didn't do this when I was shooting these images, and having to dismiss the review got really annoying as I was going through this process. So it's a quick change. Do it. Save yourself a little annoyance. Now, something you'll need to consider with, for example, the R5 Mark II and several other cameras, especially like Sony's that offer mechanical and electronic shutters, or really anything that offers a mechanical and electronic shutter, is whether you want to shoot all of these images in the electronic shutter mode, one of the mechanical shutter modes, or possibly both. I did both. First curtain electronic and fully electronic. And I really didn't expect there to be that much of a difference, but at the highest ISOs, when I looked at like 102,000, there really was. So it's something to consider. If you don't know which one you want to do, my recommendation would be to use the mechanical shutter, as that will undercorrect the electronic images, which you can then touch up, even if you're going to use the electronic shutter more often. Also, if you use the mechanical shutter, you will have a better correction for when you do use it. In any event, now that we have everything set up, we're going to set up our camera. We're going to change it to manual mode. We're going to set it to the highest ISO speed. In the case of the R5 Mark II, that'll be H, or the equivalent of 102,400. And we're going to set the shutter speed to 1/8,000th of a second. Then we're going to adjust the aperture and, if necessary, the lighting on our target to get a good setting or a good exposure at that ISO and shutter speed. Now, if you're using my target with evaluative metering on your camera and you are filling the frame with it the way you see in these tests further on and along here, I find that if you have an average exposure that's about 1 2/3 stops above the normal mid-centered meter, that's a good place to be. Now, you can, of course, double check the histogram to make sure you're not clipping anything but specular highlights, which you may have if you are using a gloss target like I am. Otherwise, you're going to get the exposure set up so that you get a good histogram that covers the whole area, especially the highlights and shadows, without clipping. Now it is simply a matter of taking a picture and adjusting the ISO and shutter speeds down to the next setting. So click, drop the ISO, drop the shutter speed, and repeat until you get to the lowest ISO on your camera. Now, I try as much as possible to start on a full shot, stop, shutter speed, and ISO. So that's why I said start 102,000 ISO, 0.008 of a second shutter speed. This way I can double check as I go through my tests that I'm not skipping or messing up stuff by ensuring that I'm still hitting full stop shutter speeds when I'm on the next full stop ISO. Or put another way, when I'm going through the tests, when I get to say ISO 1600, I should be using a shutter speed of 1/125th of a second. If I don't see that, well, then I'm messed something up, and I'm going to need to go back and redo everything to make sure that I'm doing it right. Once you've gotten all the images shot, it's time to take them into Lightroom. Now, I am using Lightroom Classic here. It's the latest version as of the recording. Check the date, September of 2024. As far as I know, you could do the same thing in the Lightroom Cloud version as well. Now, once we've imported the images, we are going to jump into Develop and start adjusting. Sort of. I don't mess with any of the settings aside from sharpening and noise reduction here, and I make sure that lens corrections are enabled because I want them to be on by default. Now, Lightroom has made this process significantly easier than it used to be, where in the past we had to set different defaults for every ISO, so we had to process every image individually. Now we only need to set a few, what I'm going to call keystone images. And Lightroom will interpolate between all of those to figure out what ISOs or what settings it should be using for those intermediate values that we didn't manually set. Now the question here is, what ISOs do we need to set this for? And to answer that question, we're going to jump over to photos.net and pull up the photographic dynamic range chart at the top of the page. Then we're going to find our camera on the list on the right-hand side and select it. Now we are looking at a chart here for the R5 Mark II, which is what I'm testing, and we will look at anywhere the line changes direction. So the angle slope changes, it goes from horizontal to a slope, it goes up, goes down, whatever. These inflection points are where we want to manually adjust noise and sharpening. Again, I call these keystone images because they're the points that really do the anchoring for this. So looking at this chart, we are going to want to adjust ISOs 50 and 100 because the line's horizontal between them, 400 because that's basically a straight decline from 100, 500 because the ISO or the image dynamic range jumps back up, and then 102,400 because it's a pretty straight line from 500 all the way to there. Now, if you shoot a lot at a specific ISO or ISO range that isn't one of the keystone images or keystone ISOs, you might also want to adjust those manually as well, just to make sure that they're fine-tuned for your needs, but strictly speaking, you probably won't need to. So jumping back over to Lightroom, we are going to start with the first image we shot, which is 102,400. Now I should note I am processing the images with the first curtain electronic shutter. I think I already said that, not the fully electronic ones, but we will come back to that in a bit. Again, I keep running over this point because it did throw me. Now, in the Develop module, we're going to zoom into 1:1 magnification, and we are going to set the sharpening, chroma noise reduction, and luma noise reduction all to 0. This is our starting point. Now we are going to start with chroma noise reduction. We are going to raise the chroma noise reduction slider until the chroma noise is gone, or it's at least as reduced as we can get it without impacting other aspects of the image. So when doing the chroma noise reduction adjustment, I look at the color checker. It has a combination of dark areas where the chroma noise will be really obvious and color patches that are surrounded by them. As I said, dark areas tend to show color noise very clearly, and those color patches will show you if you are over-reducing the color noise, as what will happen is the outer edges of those will start to lose their color, at which point you've over-reduced the chroma noise. Now, I personally find chroma noise is the easiest to deal with because if you know what you're looking for, it's really easy to see if you've gone too far. Put simply, increase the chroma noise reduction until the color noise goes away, but not so much that it starts removing color from those colors in the color checker. Now, once the chroma noise has been removed, we want to work on luma noise. Luma noise is more subjective, at least that's my experience. And this is especially true with high-resolution cameras like the R5 Mark II and anything that's similar 45, 50, 60 megapixels, because we look at pictures, not pixels. And noise can exist in the pixel level that does not actually have a negative visual impact on the picture. So we don't have to make things perfectly smooth. Now, in general, I'll start raising the noise reduction or the lumen noise reduction slider until noise looks reasonably well controlled. At high ISOs, however, I will not try to remove all of the noise, as honestly, that just ends up making the image look overly smooth. And if the image looks really good at low ISOs without even cranking it up, I will leave it very low, 0, 5, something like that. It does not have to be cranked up. Now, usually when I'm doing lumen noise reduction, what I look at in my test chart is fine detail, and specifically that would be the resolution wedges in the center. This way I can see when the noise reduction starts blurring those fine details, well, too much for my taste, let's say, and then back it off to something I find reasonable. Now, the final step here is to reapply our default sharpening. And like luminoise, the right level of sharpening is, I feel, a matter of taste. Some people are going to look at what I'm setting here and they're going to say, whoa, dude, that's way over sharpened. Other people aren't going to think it looks right or sharpened enough. I guarantee it's all over the place. Now, what I have found with my R5, which is the same resolution as the R5 Mark II, is that I usually wanted the sharpening to be somewhere between 60 and 80 in low noise, low ISO images. However, at higher ISO images, I would definitely bring the sharpening down and maybe even add some default masking in to keep the Lightroom from sharpening noise in smooth colored areas where it shouldn't be sharpened, and it makes the noise more distracting. Now, once you've done your sharpening and noise reduction on your keystone images, we need to create a preset. Now, to do this, the easiest way is to switch to grid view and select all of the keystone images, use Control or hold Control, click on the images, that routine. Now, with those images selected, we're going to go back into develop, click the thing at the top or hit D on your keyboard, either way. On the left side of the screen, find the preset panel and click the plus icon in the preset panel's heading. Then select Create Preset from the menu that pops up. Now here, I'm going to uncheck everything except for the details section, which is the sharpening and noise reduction, and the lens correction section, because I want that to be enabled where it already was by default, but we're going to just double check on that or double make sure on that. I also disable the support amount slider because it's not strictly necessary and I don't really need it for this application. And finally, at the bottom window, you want to check the box that says Create ISO Adaptive Preset. Now, if this is not available, hit cancel and make sure you selected all the images that you adjusted. It will only be available if multiple images are selected. Now, finally, give the preset a name. I just called mine R5 2 defaults. Or, if you've got another camera, call it whatever your camera model is. And I also keep mine in a group that's just my default camera presets. It keeps the library or the settings a little more coordinated. Finally, click Create to create your preset. Now, to make this a default, we set this up in the Lightroom Preferences. To find this, you will either go to Edit Preferences on Windows or the Lightroom menu and Preferences on Mac OS. You can hit Command or Control comma on your keyboard to bring up the setting menu and then switch to the Presets tab. Now, under the Raw Defaults selection, it's like the second part in there, second area in there, make sure Override Global Defaults for specific cameras is checked. If you have never done this before, it probably won't be. And then select your camera from the list below it, and the preset we just created from the default drop down just below where you selected your camera. Finally, click Create Default to create your new camera default preset that will be automatically applied. Now, you can update the defaults at any time, either by updating your preset if you wanted to change the noise reduction or something like that, or you can change or remove the defaults as a whole by coming back to this tab in the settings menu and adjusting or removing it from here. Now, with the camera default created, the last thing I want to do is give a quick check over to see how things look. Now, for this, I jump back into default, I select all the images, but this time I selected the ones I shot with the electronic shutter instead of the mechanical first curtain electronic shutter, and I reset them to their defaults, which now the defaults is going to be the newly created preset we just made. Now, if you didn't shoot a second set of images like I did, you can just reset your originals and they will be reset to your preset defaults. The ones that you changed will be the same because those are the ones you used as your keystone images. Now, we just look through the images at various ISOs and see how things look. And right away, I noticed a big change in noise in the ISO 100,000 image. Now, when I was doing this, I actually thought for some reason I had adjusted the electronic shutter images, not the first curtain electronic shutter images, and I was looking at the first curtain electronic shutter images. It was backwards, and I had it backwards in my head, and that's I freaked out a little bit, honestly. Now, of course, in stopping and thinking about this, this makes sense. There's less dynamic range when using the electronic shutter than there is when using the mechanical one on these cameras. And there are only two ways to affect dynamic range. Either the noise floor comes up, so the image gets noisier, or the amount of signal that's captured goes down, which that's based on how many electrons the sensor can hold. Now, in this case, it's very clear that the dynamic range is going down because the noise levels have come up, which is actually what we would expect anyway. As a result, my ISO 100,000 preset is not as strong as it needs to be for the electronic shutter. That said, I'm not going to change it. First of all, I rarely shoot at ISO 100,000, and it's not something that's a big deal if I have to adjust it. Second of all, adjusting for it when I do is not a problem in the way that this is set up. So one thing to keep in mind is the whole idea in some case behind these presets is, ideally they would be perfect. You'd never have to change sharpening or anything like that at all. Barring that, I would rather have the preset be slightly under-correcting in terms of intensity than what I would consider perfect. I'm going to look at the picture and say, that's a little noisier than I like, and crank up the noise reduction a touch. As opposed to having it overcorrect, and then I'm going to constantly be looking at pictures going, why is this image so soft? Or why is this so blurry or smeared or whatever? And then I'm going to have to remember to touch that down if I remember that the preset was overcorrecting. So something to keep in mind when you're doing this is try to aim for a little under, not over. So that is the first step I take in familiarizing myself with any new camera I get. I do this with every camera I have. Goes back all the way to the 40D, which was like the second camera I owned, before I take it out in the field and start shooting with it. The idea, again, is that I want to know what I can expect at any of the ISOs I shoot with or any of the ISOs on the camera, and what ISOs I might want to avoid due to excessive noise or something to that effect. So if you do something similar with your new cameras, I would love to hear about what you do, the process you use. So leave that in the comments and maybe we'll find something even better. That said, I hope you found this useful or at least interesting. If you did, let me know by hitting that like button. Also, if this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you haven't already. Finally, if you'd like to help and support this channel, you can help us for free by liking this video, sharing it with your friends, and leaving a comment with your experiences. Likewise, you can support us by hitting that thanks button or buying yourself something you've always wanted from one of the affiliate links in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.